Welcome to Module 1 of a training put together by the COVID-19 Task Force. This training is going to teach you about cultural humility and how we can use cultural humility to build our competence as pro bono volunteers or legal aid staff to better serve low-income clients who are from cultures different from our own. To start us off, I'm privileged to introduce the Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for Justice Initiatives here in New York, the Honorable Edwina Richardson Mendelson.
Hello and welcome. I hope everyone is well and healthy during these challenging times. I thank you all for participating in this cultural humility training. My name is Edwina Richardson Mendelson, and I serve as Deputy Chief Administrative Judge for Justice Initiatives for the New York State Court System. In that role, I am honored to lead the Office for Justice Initiatives, which is tasked with ensuring meaningful access to justice in all courts for all New Yorkers, regardless of income, background, or special need. This cultural humility training is divided into two parts. The first is composed of 3 modules that can be viewed on demand at any time, while the second part will be delivered in a scheduled session conducted over Zoom or a similar video platform. We encourage participants in this training to build an understanding of a client's background and livelihood, as well as contextualize the interactions that clients have with the legal system. The concept of cultural humility focuses on the process of self-reflection and discovery in order to build an honest and trustworthy relationship. It calls for an in-depth analysis of the disparities among different cultures and the interactions with the legal system as they are experienced by individuals within various cultures. It also addresses power imbalances that may greatly influence legal outcomes. In this training, we will touch upon topics of implicit bias, intersectionality, microaggressions, and among many others. A thorough understanding of these themes will help identify the different intersecting identities that can influence a client's case and will help build and strengthen the relationship between lawyer and client. I strongly urge all participants to engage in this experience with open ears, open hearts, and open minds. That will enable you to be your very best as you serve clients impacted by the COVID-19 crisis and those experiencing resulting legal issues. I want to also acknowledge the difficulty that the ongoing pandemic has imposed on your very own personal lives and legal work. And I want to thank you for your sacrifice and your service to your communities. As volunteer pro bono attorneys, your willingness to make yourselves available despite these hardships is commendable, and your role is critically important as we move forward. I hope you all enjoy this program. I fully expect you to benefit deeply from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Judge Mendelson. So I want to join the judge in thanking you for volunteering to serve low-income clients. The trainers you're going to see in the next, whenever you view the individual modules and the final module, are all experienced in providing diversity, cultural humility training to others for many years, but we are not as experienced in doing it virtually. So we welcome your feedback. We will have the opportunity to develop and improve this training as we go along, so please let us know what you think. Our goals for being here today are to help build your and our capacity to understand the context of our clients' lives. And again, to build our own capacity to understand how our clients and we interact with the legal system. The roadmap is, you're at Module 1. You're at the very beginning of this journey. Today, we are going to learn a new vocabulary for a new paradigm. We're going to learn new terms. We'll try to have a little bit of a focus on implicit bias and microaggression. but we are starting at the very beginning with definitions and understanding what is cultural humility.
One word to describe cultural humility for me is love, actually. If I had to encapsulate cultural humility, the whole concepts of cultural humility, it doesn't do it justice, but the word that I think of it is essence.
Escuchar.
Being. You.
Opening.
Receive. Compassion.
Love.
The principles of cultural humility offer one more framework to contribute to what has got to be our ultimate goal. Yes, our ultimate goal is that there will be a sense of equity, a sense of equality, and a kind of respect that we are driving forward.
Cultural
One word to
humility.
describe cultural.
Cultural humility that is a multi-dimensional concept, and certainly Melanie Tervalon and I conceptualized 3 dimensions.
The first is lifelong learning and critical self-reflection. And in that critical self-reflection, it is the understanding of how each of us, every single one of us, is a complicated, multidimensional human being. Each of us comes with our own histories and stories, our heritage, our point of view. You're looking at me now. I am very fair-skinned. When I was a little girl, my hair was blonde. My eyes are blue. People often tried to call me anything but African American. I have a history. My identity is rooted in that history. My parents gave me the knowledge of my own social identity, and my own experience in life has created that. I get to say who I am.
The second tenet, after self-reflection and ongoing lifelong learning and development, is this notion that we must mitigate the power imbalances, to recognize and mitigate the power imbalances that are inherent often in our clinician patient or clinician client or service provider community dynamics.
And then finally, the piece that I would offer that Jan and I feel people often either don't read or don't like, which is, and the institution has to model these principles as well.
So being aware of other cultures, beginning with lifelong learning, and then also engaging in self-reflection, and ultimately going with what we know in order to address our power imbalances. Cultural competence may be the term you've heard before, but we think that building competence really begins with being culturally humble. Again, as we try to do this work, as we try to communicate better across culture, we don't have to be perfect. We just have to be engaged with our clients and with our colleagues and committed to aligning our values with action. Many of you may have seen this graphic. It's one of the early attempts to visualize the work that we were trying to do to distinguish between when we treat people equally, give everybody the same size box, the same handicap, so to speak, versus when we treat people with equity, when we give everyone what they need to participate more fully. And as time has gone on, the graphic has changed, right? So we start in the first box, an illustration of our current reality, then on to how we can treat everyone equally, then with equity, and finally, what we might all be yearning for, justice, which is the removal of all barriers so that there can be full participation. And in the perfect world, the next graphic, and I've seen it sometimes but couldn't find it for this training, is those kids are all out on the field and they're playing, they're fully participating. More vocabulary to get used to understand. You've heard about 8 million times, right, the term diversity. This is the condition of having many different elements. Think about how many of you come from a workplace that is filled with employees of different backgrounds, a workplace that is diverse. It's much more likely, I think, that we are in workplaces where we might be struggling a little bit to diversify. Or if we're lucky and we are in a workplace that is diverse, filled with people who are different from each other, then the challenge is how to treat everyone fairly with equity. And that is what's needed to move us along to inclusion. Again, making sure everyone has a seat at the table, access to the playing field, maybe even being on the playing field. And it is the case that these three concepts, these words, which are always tied together, diversity, equity, and inclusion, DE&I. They're very, very different, though related concepts, right? Equity is how we can move from diversity to inclusion. So as Dean Verona says, it's one thing to have people who are diverse, but having equitable systems in place is the only way to make sure those diverse people are represented and ultimately included in the conversation. You're also going to be in Module 2, get educated about the meaning and impact of intersectionality. Here we're talking about the disadvantages and sometimes the advantages that are felt by people due to a combination of factors. A Black woman, an Asian woman, we might face discrimination, not necessarily distinctly due to race, but it could also be, or gender, but also due to a unique combination of those two characteristics. We also live in a world and a culture that embodies white supremacy. The idea, the ideology that white people's ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions are somehow superior to the ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and actions of people of color. And what's the impact of living in white supremacy culture? We are surrounded by many white people who profit from the ideology of white supremacy, and they may be reluctant to share power or to share the ability to change. This culture expresses and justifies and binds together our country's white supremacy system, and it glues white-controlled institutions into systems and the global white supremacy system. You see white supremacy culture deeply embedded when we begin to examine our own implicit biases and the impact that our biases have on the justice system. You probably understand that bias operates to distort accuracy and to thwart or stop justice. What are our implicit biases? They are the unconscious thoughts about race, sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation that we might be embarrassed about. We might try to hide them, but nevertheless, these unconscious biases exist right here. Even though we fight them, they're always with us. And in fact, most of our decision-making, a very small percentage would be visible, right? Most of it is the iceberg way below the surface of the water in terms of how we ourselves make decisions. Over and over again, we turn to the shortcuts, the schemas in our mind that are activated without awareness, but that, boom, are affecting our decisions. It becomes a little bit like peanut butter and jelly. So we're gonna watch this quick video about peanut butter and jelly and racism.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up
in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there is an overrepresentation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
So I think all of you took the time to take at least one implicit association test. And of course, we asked all of you to take the race test, which tests our ability to distinguish the faces of European and African origin. Our measurements are taken according to our reaction time, how quickly those schemas act, and what happens when the schemas are interrupted by dissonant words or images. Over a decade of testing in America, what would you think the IAT scores for the race test would show? That's between 2002 and 2015. Think about the possible outcome. Think about what percentage of Americans you think favored what group. Take a minute and write it down. Turn it over. Okay, now I'm going to show you that in that 13 years, 68% of IAT test takers in America had either a strong automatic, moderate automatic, or slight automatic preference for European Americans compared to African Americans. And these kinds of results are mirrored across the globe. Light-skinned people are favored over dark-skinned people, men over women, thin people over fat people, Christians over Jews, rich over poor, just down the line of what you might expect. We all have biases, including what is known as in-group biases. That is being more comfortable with, holding more positive views of members of one's own group. So these photographs, you see people of color post-Katrina who were seen carrying goods were labeled looters. White people seen carrying goods were described as people gathering food and supplies for their families. That's how in-group bias operates. And bias can impact both our perception and affect behavior. So behaviors linked to implicit bias include perceiving facial expressions differently. Some of us might get job callbacks at different rates. Some may see criminal activity or guns more quickly, but not necessarily more accurately in relation to some racial groups, in particular African Americans. And bias can interrupt our own lawyering systems as well. They shape our work, how we see our clients, how we judge our stories, how and what we advocate for clients, what we think they can achieve or how we think they can live, which clients and what problems are more significant than others. So what clients deserve full representation in a court or in an administrative hearing, even down to our very small micro interactions. Are we warm to them? Do we take their call? Do we go an extra mile? Every day as lawyers, as people in the universe, we can experience or observe microaggressions. Microaggressions can be a little bit like mosquito bites. They might seem minor to some people, but some of us are bit all the time, and we suffer more because of them. Microaggressions, like many other of the kinds of behavioral reactions to bias, they occur because of our own implicit bias, because we fail to recognize individual experiences, and because of a belief that microaggressions are minor and not harmful. It's really just the opposite. Microaggressions cause a great deal of harm. They can cause an assault on mental or emotional health. They can drain confidence, problem-solving abilities, and productivity. We see or witness or commit microaggressions all the time. So think about this one. You are an attorney of Caucasian descent, and you and your colleague of African-American descent have been preparing for a criminal trial for weeks. On the first day of the trial, you and your colleague enter the courtroom, both dressed in your best. The court officer assumes your colleague is the defendant and directs him to the defendant's seat at the table. So you can assume you're the attorney of Caucasian descent, or you can assume you're the attorney of African-American descent, the bystander or the target. Tell us in your reflections how you would react or respond. Your choice: do nothing, keep it light, keep it moving, or confronting it directly. We'd love to hear from you as you send us your reflections. Thanks so much for your time today. I hope this was a good introduction, and I look forward to possibly meeting you in person on the 24th if you want to join us for a little bit of Q&A in person, and definitely on the 26th as we go through the final module. Thanks so much.